fortunate this morning to see John de Gruchy, meet John de Gruchy, Professor John de Gruchy, well-known scholar in South Africa, worldwide also. John, it's such a privilege, and yesterday was your birthday, so happy birthday.
Thank you.
We hope there are many more.
Well, at 86, you don't think there are going to be many more, but at any rate,
You're looking good for 86 and still working a lot.
we'll take it as it comes.
Yeah. John, it's indeed a privilege to be
Thank
with
you.
you, and thank you for your time. John, you have done a lot of work on spirituality, but let's start with the basics. For people living in the 2025, what would you describe spirituality for you? How do you see it?
I think I'm going to say very many times in response, that's a very good question. so let me not say that again.
Thank you, John.
But that's certainly a challenging question to start with, because at one level you could say that spirituality is always what it has been and should be, and by that I'm referring to the best in spiritualities, and there is a spectrum of spiritualities according to religion and tradition and so forth and so on. There are also what I would say bogus or superficial spiritualities, but we don't need to talk about those. But even in terms of the great spiritualities, there is variation and diversity. Nevertheless, there are some common themes, common insights, so that when a person like Thomas Merton goes to visit the Buddhist communities in East Asia, they don't agree on the theologies that they represent, but there's a deeper spirituality that they seem to have in common. Even if it is expressed in different terms, it sort of connects in a profound kind of way. I'm not saying it's the same, but it certainly corresponds. So if you think back to early Christian spirituality, which was very deeply rooted in the Psalms and in the Hebrew tradition, as this was absorbed within the first Christian communities, and then especially in what became the monastic communities in the 4th century in the African desert and elsewhere, there's a long tradition there, and it's an expanding tradition, and it develops depending on context, which is very important, I think, in terms of what you're talking about. In South Africa, Volmoed and so forth, it's a different context to other contexts. And nevertheless, there are similarities, and there are commonalities in terms of spirituality. So when we talk about spirituality today, we're mindful of that whole tradition of complexity and diversity in spiritualities, even within the Christian tradition, that then take shape in the different big Christian traditions, the Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, later the Protestant in its various forms. And there are underlying connections between them, so that one could say, taken together, there is a commonality, a Christian commonality that connects them, even though there is some difference between, let's say, how a Lutheran might speak about it and a Quaker or a Coptic in Egypt. But you can see the resemblances. It's a sort of family resemblance. So So today we've got that whole history and experience over centuries that we can draw on and rework it in terms of where we are now. And of course, there are diversities in that, not just in terms of between traditions, but within the traditions themselves. So that Franciscan spirituality and the spirituality of the Dominicans and the Franciscans and so on is not identical, but there are commonalities, obviously, and it's all based on a Catholic understanding of the Church and so forth. So, assuming that we have some awareness, obviously none of us has a full grasp of that whole complex story, but we have some awareness of the development, and we bring to it our own experience and our own tradition and background, and then we find ourselves in a changing world and different contexts. So what may seem to make great sense, let's say, in North America, may not make quite the same sense in Southern Africa. So spirituality is connected to context as well as to tradition and traditions. And we've got to try and not preference the one tradition over the other, because we can learn from them all, nor should we think of each context as fundamentally different, because we're all human beings living on planet Earth in the 21st century, and with mass communication and instant communication, more and more we are caught up in the same dynamics, and invariably affected by what happens in other contexts. So that, for example, in terms of here, southern tip of Africa, we are as much affected by artificial intelligence as people in Europe or in North America. So all of these things impact upon us. They may impact upon us at different levels of intensity and in different ways, but they're there. And in working through our own understanding of what spirituality is for us today in this place, is obviously not disconnected from other places. Nevertheless, we may have some insights and experiences that complement or challenge or can learn from others.
So if we move to the commonalities, more, I would say more the basics of the spirituality elements of spirituality that you get in all traditions, what would you highlight?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about, let's say, the Christian tradition, and we work from the assumption that the Christian tradition, the spirituality of Christianity, is rooted in the way in which we understand and read the New Testament, and behind that, of course, the Hebrew Scriptures, then we can see various things that are obvious there, that from the Acts of the Apostles, the first Christians met together, they prayed together, they broke bread together, they listened to the Apostles' teaching, they discovered how they should respond to the surrounding culture in terms of their attitude to people of other cultures and people who were in need, and all of that shaped their spirituality, and they brought into the mix living with the Psalms, which was a sort of hymn book, if you like, as one can see in the New Testament. So often there's a reference to the Psalms which indicate that they were living out of the text, and then they were interpreting it, of course, in a particular way in relationship to who Jesus was for them, and that provided the basic shape of Christian spirituality going forward. And most, if not every, form of Christian spirituality that develops later comes out of that. So there's prayer, there's Eucharist, there's worship, and a lot of other things that make up that, and reflection on Scripture, devotio, what we call now the devotio, the lectio devotiona, and then you get, with the rise of monasticism, an emphasis on silence, on meditation, and so forth, and then it all builds on that.
So the purpose of spirituality for those early church people was really to hear the voice of God for their practical living conditions.
Yeah.
So it was not an individualistic sort of
No.
approach, like just me and God.
No.
Sort of a spiritual, I sit somewhere, I've got this wonderful feeling, and then it's all about me and God.
No, in fact, they were very wary of that because it reminded them of Gnosticism and of other spiritualities that didn't quite fit in with what they were talking about, because their spirituality was shaped by the gospel and by their living together in community as the body of Christ. So it was very much a communal thing. It was very much based on their understanding of who Jesus Christ was for them. And it was also connected to mission, because the church from the beginning had a self-understanding of being a mission to the world, and that meant breaking through cultural barriers. It meant translating the gospel into different languages and all of that stuff that we know about. And that was all connected to spirituality. In other words, spirituality wasn't a subsection of the church's life. It was at the heart of it, and therefore connected to everything else, whether it was mission or worship or whatever.
So, John, if we come to the day and age that we live in,
Yes.
what are the forces, or let's put it more positive, what are the influences of the world that's shaping the form of spirituality? You reference AI.
Mm-hmm.
What are the different aspects that you see?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very interesting just to reflect. I know very little about AI. I'm learning fast because I'm trying to grapple with it myself. But AI is really fundamentally, it's about communication. And in the past, human beings communicated with each other by speech, by texts, letters, scriptures, and so forth and so on. I mean, the New Testament is all about communicating the message, and you've got it starts off as oral, it then develops into a written form, and that divides into different kinds of written material, whether it's a letter or a narrative like the Gospels or what have you. What's happening now is, of course, with the rise of the computer and the digital age, is that communication has become almost instantaneous. So that is instantaneous, and less and less do we feel in control of it, because it can be abused and misused in all kinds of ways for changing people's perception of reality, what's going on in the world, in politics, in religion, and so forth and so on. And all of a sudden, many of us are feeling out of our depth because how does one as a Christian respond to that phenomenon of QAnon in the States, which is immensely powerful, and it couldn't exist if it wasn't for the digital age, because it's all computer based, and it works on repeating algorithms all the time, so that all of a sudden, whereas previously people got the information through books and newspapers and so forth and so on, and then you could sort of work out which of it you wanted to believe and so forth. Now all of a sudden you're getting bombarded every time you turn on your computer with messages. And the artificial intelligence is not only a powerful force, but it knows who you are. And it knows what kind of information to send to you without anybody now telling it, because you're suddenly interested in what's going on in American politics with regard to President Trump, and you get bombarded with information, and you don't quite know who's put this information together. And in fact, it might not have been put together by any human being. It could just be all sorts of stuff that's been downloaded onto computers, and now it's producing its own material. So what becomes very critical in all of this is, and it's a spiritual question, what is truth? How do we discern the truth? Which I think is probably the most important question in spirituality, namely discernment. So discerning, and in discerning, when we talk about discernment, we're talking about how do we discern the truth. If for us, ultimately the truth is found in God, and specifically as Christians in God's revelation in Jesus as the way, truth, and life, then how do we connect that truth and discern that truth in relationship to all the other truths that are bombarding us every day? And how do we discern what is truth? How do we know how to respond to it, and so forth? So this is, I think, the big spiritual question, and it's always been that discernment has been at the heart of Christian spirituality, because you're trying to discern the will of God. So if the will of God is about truth, and therefore us discerning what that truth is and how to live by it, and it's understood not just as an intellectual thing, but as something that is life transforming and life informing and so forth, then we're getting to the heart of Christian spirituality, or any form of spirituality. And we might then be developing tools that help us to deal with fake news, which is alternative truths that we should be very wary of.
Excuse me. John, to stay on this, just to stay on this topic a little bit, what role do you see as Christians we have in this regard?
Yes. Again, a good question, because you alluded to the possible role when you mentioned that spirituality is not just about our individual ego massaging, as it were, that how we get some kind of spiritual kick. But Christian spirituality is invariably both at the same time communal and personal. So Um, Let me illustrate it in this way. I mean, in that wonderful little book of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Life Together, he has a chapter on the day alone and the day together. And he makes a distinction between being lonely and being alone on the one hand, and then being yourself and being in community. So in saying that Christian spirituality is communal, we're not saying it's not personal, but we are saying how we are speaking about how these are related. What we are rejecting is the idea of spirituality as being individualistic, that it's massaging your own ego in a search to become holy in some kind of way, as distinct from being interpersonal and therefore relational, and therefore your own personal journey spiritually is connected to that of others, which doesn't mean you shouldn't be spending time in your own personal silence and meditation. On the contrary, because that's essential for the interpersonal thing. So Christian spirituality, let me say immediately, is at the same time personal and social, communal. So if we go back to what I was saying about the digital world in which we are living, we can't hope to respond to this just as individuals. That's impossible. And that does raise the question about computer geeks who spend their whole life on their own in front of a computer looking at these problems. Well, I don't think a Christian can be a computer geek in that sense, because our spirituality is grounded in relationships, relationship with God, with one another, with neighbor, with enemy, and so forth. And therefore, when we look at the challenges now of the digital age, we look at them together in conversation with each other, not just with us in conversation with a computer screen. And we've got a set of questions that we bring to that discussion together, such as what kind of world is it that we want or need? How does this relate to people who are disadvantaged or poor or oppressed? What does this mean for us when we gather together for worship? Is it that we just come to worship as individuals and go away as individuals, or is there some other much more profound understanding of what we are doing when we worship? So, yeah, I think that would be the kind of framework within which I'd want to explore these issues. People who are disadvantaged or poor or oppressed. What does this mean for us when we gather together for worship? Is it that we just come to worship as individuals and go away as individuals, or is there some other much more profound understanding of what we are doing when we worship? So, yeah, I think that would be the kind of framework within which I'd want to explore these issues.
When you mentioned we have to distinguish what kind of world we want, I was just thinking about what's happening geopolitically in the world today.
Yeah.
And to put it lightly, it seems like everything is just turning on its head.
Yeah.
Even in my lifetime, I haven't experienced, and I don't live that long,
Yeah.
but I haven't experienced something like this. So it's a whole new ball game, and from what I understand from Christianity and Christian spirituality, that's not the way that it should go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it in a certain sense, the way that the geopolitical forces are operating today are kind of an enemy towards what I stand for.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do one respond I think that's what I talk about, the uncertainty that we live in. And how did Bonhoeffer dealt with uncertainty?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting that, I mean, Pope Francis is currently very ill, and one doesn't quite know what's going to happen there. But he's just published his autobiography called Hope, which I've read. And although I'm not a Roman Catholic, I just think it's a very profound, wonderful book. And he is, each chapter is in a sense focusing on some aspect of this question of who are we, what kind of world do we want, how do we relate to each other. He's even got a chapter in which he deals with artificial intelligence. So, yeah, and what he's saying, I think, in his book is that the Christian vision of society and the human being is an alternative to what is becoming dominant in the world. So what is happening globally in terms of global politics and culture, and which is manifesting itself in obvious ways that I needn't elaborate on, often is counter to the Christian understanding of reality in the world. And that means that our spirituality needs to shape the way in which we respond to that reality in terms of a different reality. So we could perhaps put it this way, that there are two opposing realities in the world, and that's very much like in the New Testament. You know, there's a struggle going on between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of evil, or however you want to describe it. I don't want to overstate that because it sometimes can be misunderstood, as it is, and not least by people that are we finding quite threatening. They see us as the kingdom of evil and themselves as the kingdom of good. So we've got to be fairly careful and sensitive about how we use these terms. But nevertheless, there is a struggle going on. I wrote a book recently, as you may know, on monasticism, this monastic moment, and the subtitle of that was "The War of the Spirit." What did I call it? Something like that, and that's more or less what I'm talking about. There was a profound sense amongst the first monastics who were reacting to Christendom, the attempt to control politics and culture from the imperial throne, from Constantine and Theodosius and so forth. And they were saying, hang on a moment, that doesn't correspond with the gospel. And we're going into the desert to discern what the gospel is saying about being human and living together in community and so forth and so on. That doesn't mean to say we all have to become monks, but we can learn from that in terms of what's going on in the world today. In fact, I've just written an article on that, which is coming out in the Stellenbosch Journal of Theology at some point, which is very much on that particular question. So if our spirituality doesn't help us to live in a counter-cultural way, in other words, live according to the gospel, in fact, if our spirituality actually reinforces our acceptance of the culture that is being thrust upon us, then it's something to be resisted. And it can only be resisted by a counter-spirituality. It can't simply be resisted by preaching and prophetic statements, and all of that may be important, are important. But there has to be a different way of being Christian to challenge that way of being Christian.
John, isn't the positive aspect of this whole bombardment that we get from AI and fake news and whatever, why instead of trying to show the falsehoods in the so-called other camp, going back to a more positive, hopeful approach to say, what do we really believe the gospel of Jesus Christ is about for us today?
Yeah.
And disseminate that, because I believe that we have for every day and every time in history a new understanding of what the gospel of Jesus Christ means.
Yeah.
Having said that, and on the way doing that, it also will crystallize how the world that we want to live in looks like.
Yeah.
And instead of going into combat mode, which is sort of humans and Christians and whatever's first mode, I want to make sure that they know that they are right, wrong,
Yeah.
and we are right, is rather to go back and, like what you said, Christianity has been living with this dilemma.
Tension, yeah. Well, you're absolutely right, because one of the things that people need to understand is that many people who may disagree with us on politics and culture and so forth regard themselves as profoundly and deeply Christian, and that their response to what's going on and their support for Donald Trump and so forth and so on, for them is part of their being Christian. This is their understanding of what it means to be Christian. And as much as we might disagree with them, we must respect them as human beings and their sincerity. I'm not sure that they're all sincere, because I think there's some manipulating the whole thing. I'm quite sure they are. And they are manipulating those Christians within their orbit. But our real struggle is not against them. It's actually against falsehood. It's about the abuse of power and so forth. That's what it's about.
Yeah, the actions.
Yeah. So you are right. Our response to that is to be more truly Christian as we understand that. And that does have to do with the questions: who is Jesus Christ for us? What then is the church? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live in community? What does it mean to do justice? All of those questions. Those are the questions we should be asking ourselves as we respond to what's happening in the world. Yes. And spirituality enables us to do that. Yeah.
John, if we move to the third part of our discussion, say, for instance, we get it off the ground to get a group to South Africa.
Yeah.
What do you see as the main pointers that South Africa, through our history, through our grappling with our own spirituality and relationship with apartheid and all those things, where we stand at the moment?
Yeah.
What do you think we can offer the world coming to visit South Africa? If we say this is embrace spirituality in times of uncertainty, an African journey, what does for your African journey mean?
Yeah. I think there are two parts to that, because it's an African journey, but it's also a specifically South African journey.
Yeah.
And the experience of people coming here will be a South African experience, which is African, but there's a particular history in terms of South Africa. So it'll be a different experience to, let's say, going to Malawi or Kenya or Egypt, very different. But they're all African journeys. And we learn from each of them, and we learn a little differently from each of them. I spent some time with the Copts in Egypt, so yes, that's an African journey, but that's a very distinct kind of journey. And I think even just north of our border, there will be a different dimension to it. So what we would need to unpack here would be what is specifically South African, with emphasis on both those words. The South African experience, which is a very complex historical experience. It goes colonial, apartheid, Mandela, post-apartheid, and now where we are now, which is unique. It's not the same in even Zimbabwe or Namibia, and certainly not further afield. So there's a unique story there, and a story within which the church played a role. But even then, to talk about the church, wow, what a complex thing the church is in South Africa, when you think that the majority of Christians belong to African indigenous churches rather than recognizably Catholic or Methodist or what have you. So one would have to unpack that church story, which is very complex indeed, and unlike most other parts in the world and in Africa. So the political, cultural experience that we've had from colonial times to the present is one theme. The other is the theme of the development of the church in South Africa into its various constituent parts. That looks now very different from what it did look when I was a student of theology in the 1950s. And for much of my ministry, it's changed radically in many, many ways. So that within what I usually refer to as the ecumenical church, in other words, those churches that connect with each other through ecumenical councils, the World Council, South African Council, we have a sort of a symbiotic relationship, which is a little different to what we might have with some of the indigenous churches and some others. Within that framework, there are certain commonalities, but even then there are different theologies at work, from theologies that have grown out of colonial Christianity, others that have grown out of liberation and black theology, and so forth. And then, of course, the denominational theologies, whether it's Catholic, Anglican, Dutch Reformed, what have you. So all of that comes into the mix. And learning from all that and putting it all together is a complex thing. No more complex, in fact, probably less than Christianity in North America, because, I mean, that's pretty complex and takes a lot of understanding, because what it means to be a Baptist in, let us say, in Boston, and what it might mean to be in Mississippi is somewhat different, I would think.
Yeah. John, lastly, how, and I know this is hypothetical, theoretical, but from the works from Desmond Tutu, what would you say are the lights that speaks to us, that comes up for us in a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because I knew him very well, and I probably have had more conversations with him than read what he wrote, though I've read a lot of what he wrote and heard him speak on many occasions. I think what is critical in terms of what he stood for is his journey, his own personal journey, his autobiography. Because his autobiography actually unpacks the way in which his understanding of the church, spirituality, and the witness of the church really developed. Because Tutu can be studied in different phases of his life, like anybody. And of course, he lived to 90 years old. So the Tutu that we experienced week by week here at Volmoed, when he used to come and worship with us, is not exactly, it's the same Tutu, but it's also a slightly different Tutu that when he was opposing P.W. Botha and Foster during the height of the struggle against apartheid. So one's got to read his autobiography and then locate his other writings in relationship to that. For example, his Book of Joy, which is his dialogue with the Dalai Lama, it's at a different point in his journey to some of his earlier writings, where he's dealing specifically with apartheid. Nevertheless, there are some constant things. He's always a person who's looking for ways in which to heal relationships, even when he's speaking out against apartheid and writing strong letters to prime ministers and presidents and so forth and so on. He's always trying to suggest a way of how we can overcome it and find each other and work together to get to peace. So, I mean, a lot of white folk back then saw him as a sort of a radical, almost a demagogue way in which he was. But that wasn't him at all. Of course, he was saying things like they were, but he was always trying to find a way to address the people that he was criticizing in a way that could bring about some kind of reconciliation. So I think it's... and Desmond was a profoundly spiritual being. I mean, ever since I knew him, and it went back to the late 1950s or early 60s when I first met him, he was a person of prayer, of worship, before anything else. So there's a profound spirituality there, out of which came his prophetic statements and his ministry of reconciliation. So, yeah.
John, thank you very much for your time. One last indicator from John de Gruchy. What shall we look out for?
That he's still around when you guys arrive.
We will pray for that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. One thing I think for me is important is, as it is for my wife, that is not to stop inquiring, working at a project. If people ask me what have I done in my retirement, which started now 25 years almost ago, I've been just as busy and active in these 25 years and try to keep at that. Because once we stop struggling with the issues, stop reading, stop reflecting and thinking, we actually stop. And I think we've all of us, I'm not talking about myself here, all of us have still got something to contribute as we grow older. But in order to do that, we've got to keep alert.